Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me of studying Parashat Achrei. Parashat Achrei is a very complicated parasha with a very heavy issue. And I titled this class, Trying to Understand God's Ways. And obviously we're going to discuss the death of Aharon's two children, Nadav and Abihu. The Torah begins by saying, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe, and Hashem spoke to Moshe. Achrei mot shnei bnei Aharon, after the death of Aaron's children, Nadav and Abihu, bekorvatam lifnei Hashem vayamutu, when they came close to God and they died. And obviously the death of two righteous people, and even if they did commit a sin, it obviously brings the question of what we call tzaddik v'ra lo, rasha v'tov lo. Can righteous people suffer? Can evil people prosper? How exactly God runs this world? All those questions, we will try to touch upon them and perhaps to pave a path to some kind of a thought that might help us to deal with the issue. The pasuk, a verse in Kohelet, in chapter 9, second verse, says the following: הכל כאשר לכל, מקרה אחד לצדיק ולרשע, לטוב ולטהור ולטמא ולזובח ולאשר איננו זובח. Basically, King Solomon says in his wisdom, everyone at the end deserves the same thing. מקרה אחד, there is one מקרה, everything is happenstances. For the tzaddik, for the righteous person, for the rasha, for the evil person, latov, for the person who is a good person, latahor, for someone who is pure, latameh, for someone who is not pure, lazoveach, to someone who brings a sacrifice, ולאשר איננו זובח, and to someone who does not bring a sacrifice. כתוב כחוטא נשבע כאשר שבועה ירא. And there is the same, at the end, there is the same justice or the same judgment, really, against someone who just takes oath and promises in vain, and for someone who is afraid to take an oath. So obviously, when we read that pasuk, we fully understand that we need to have some kind of an explanation to it. Theologically, we need to understand it. How can you say that there is going to be one judgment for a rasha, for an evil person, and for a tzaddik, for a righteous person? So why to bother to do any commandments? Why to be a good person if at the end of the day it's the same thing? And the second question that we need to ask is, why do we need to have such a long list in order to prove his point? Tzaddik, righteous, rasha, evil, tov, good, tahor, pure, eino tahor, tameh, impure. Why do we need to have such a list? You just get your point by saying, mikre echad lakol. There's going to be one judgment for everyone, and everyone is basically the same. So, obviously we understand that King Solomon, with his wisdom, is trying to encourage us to dig a bit deeper and to try to understand. And this pasuk from Kohelet is exactly where the Midrash, and that's what we're going to do today, to learn Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, which is one of the more ancient Midrashim, Midrash Agadah, that basically try to understand the idea of the death of Aaron's children and what King Solomon says. So let's try to learn together. אחרי מות שני בני אהרון, after the death of Aaron's children, two of his children, Rabbi Shimon made his opening statement in his drasha, in his explanation. He brings the pasuk in Kohelet that we mentioned before. הכל כאשר לכל, מקרה אחד לצדיק ולרשע. Which means, מקרה אחד, there is one happenstance, there is one case, there is one judgment to the righteous and to the evil. Who is the righteous person? Who is the evil person? So says Rabbi Shimon, לצדיק זה נוח, שנאמר בו איש צדיק. So who is the tzaddik that King Solomon is talking about when he says mikre echad latzadik? This is Noach. Because it says in Genesis, Noach was a righteous person. אמר רבי יוחנן בשם רבי אליעזר בנו של רבי יוסי הגלילי. So Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, who was the son of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Noach, כשיצא מן התיבה, when Noach left the ark, הקישו הערי ושברו, ולא היה כשר להקריב, והקריב שם בנו תחתיו. Which is a very interesting, really, I would say fascinating midrash that basically says that when Noach left the ark, the lion jumped on Noach, basically took part of his hand, and therefore Noach could not bring a sacrifice, and instead his son Shem had to bring a sacrifice instead of his father Noach. ולרשע, and who is the רשע? זה פרעה נכו. כיוון שביקש לשב על הכיסא של שלמה, לא היה יודע מנהגיו. So פרעה נכו, not Pharaoh from Egypt at the time of the Jewish people in Egypt, but there is another Pharaoh. By the way, the name Pharaoh is just a nickname for Egyptian kings. So when Pharaoh, at the time of King Solomon, after King Solomon died, the Egyptian empire invaded a bit Israel. And when King Pharaoh wanted to sit on King Solomon's throne, לא היה יודע מנהגיו, he didn't know how to sit on that throne, because King Solomon created some kind of a mechanism that you cannot just sit on the throne. You need to do a few things. הקישו ערי ושברו. זה מת צולע וזה מת צולע. So what happened? A lion came and basically also hurt King Pharaoh, and he also caused him a physical damage. So says the Midrash, זה מת צולע וזה מת צולע, היינו דכתיב, מקרה אחד לצדיק ולרשע. So the Midrash says, at the end of the day, Noach died while he was limping. Pharaoh, King Pharaoh, at the time of King Solomon, also died while he was limping. So basically, מקרה אחד, so one case, one condition for both. For the tzaddik, for Noach, who died while limping, and to Pharaoh, who died while limping. Which means, basically the Midrash says, what King Solomon says, that at the end of the day, tzaddik and rasha, they both die, and they can die the same way and in the same condition, was fulfilled with Noach and King Pharaoh. So then, the Midrash continues with trying to understand the continuation of the verse. לטוב ולטהור ולטמא. So King Solomon says that מקרה אחד לכל, there is going to be one ending at the end for everyone. And on that list we had tzaddik, Noach, rasha, King Pharaoh. So who is the good, the pure, and the impure? So says the Midrash, לטוב זה משה. Good, it's Moshe. Moses שנאמר in Exodus, ותרא אותו כי טוב הוא. And she opened up the basket and she saw that he is good. So Moshe correspond to good. Rabbi Meir אומר שנולד מהול. Maybe even Moses was born circumcised already. ולטהור, who is the tahor? Who is the pure person? זה אהרון. It's obviously Aaron, Moshe's brother. שהיה עוסק בטהרתן של ישראל. Because he was engaged in purifying the Jewish people. שנאמר, בשלום ובמישור הלך איתי, ורבים השיב מעוון. Because it says in Malachi that Aaron went with God, with peace, with tranquility, and he caused a lot of people to repent from their transgressions. So he is considered the tahor. So the tov is Moshe, the good is Moshe, tahor, pure, is Aaron, who is the tameh, ולטמא אלו מרגלים. The spies, the 12 spies that Moshe and Aaron send to scatter the land, they are called, their nickname in the Midrash, based on the verse, is that they are tameh, טמאים, impure. אילו אמרו שבחה של ארץ ישראל, אלו אמרו שבחה של ארץ ישראל, ואלו אמרו גנאי. Now, the Midrash does not explain why the Meraglim are called impure, but the Midrash is trying to compare Moshe and Aaron and to the Meraglim, which is very strange. So the Midrash is saying the following: Elu, Moshe and Aaron, they said good things, praises about the land of Israel. They said, we know it's a good land that is filled with milk and honey. Ve'elu, the spies, amru gnai. The spies said, yes, it's true. Maybe it's a good land, but we will never be able to conquer it. And they start bad-mouthing the land of Israel, saying that the land devour its inhabitants. So then, what was at the end? Says the Midrash, Elu lo nichnesu, ve'elu lo nichnesu. The Meraglim, the spies, couldn't enter the land of Israel. Obviously, they died. And Moshe and Aaron also did not enter the land of Israel. Now, this is amazing because we know that Moshe and Aaron, at least according to the narrative, they were not allowed to enter the land of Israel because of what they did with the rock, hitting the rock instead of talking to the rock. Not because of the Meraglim, but the Midrash basically look at the end of their lives and says Moshe and Aaron had in a way the same ending like the Meraglim. None of them, not Moshe and Aaron, not the Meraglim, not the spies were able to enter the land of Israel. So, mikre echad lekulam. At the end of the day, sometimes you can be good, you can be pure, you will get the same ending like someone else. תכתיב לטוב ולטהור ולזובח. So now we're going to continue to explain the pasuk. But before we do it, I am sure that all of us now, listening to this midrash, feel very uncomfortable. Noach and King Pharaoh from King Solomon's time, Moshe, Aaron, and the Meraglim, and at the end of the day, there is almost no difference between Noach and King Pharaoh, between Moshe and Aaron and the Meraglim. That bothers us, and it should. But we will continue. דכתיב לטוב ולטהור ולטמא ולזובח. So who is this זובח? Who is this person who brings a korban? זה יושיע, שנאמר, וירום יאשיהו לבני העם צאן כבשים ובני עזים. Because it says about Yoshiyahu, and I already will bring the psukim, and Yoshiyahu gave the nation a lot of his flock, sheep, and goats to bring as a korban, ולאשר איננו זובח, and to the person who does not bring sacrifices, who is he? זה אחאב, שביטל קורבנות. As it says in דברי הימים, in Chronicles, ויזבח לו אחאב צאן ובקר לרוב, זבח לא, זבח ולא קורבנות. Which means, the Midrash now compares Yoshiyahu, who was a wonderful king, who gave the people the opportunity to bring korbanot, to bring sacrifices to the temple, and by doing so, allowing them to come closer to God. And Ahab, who was a very, I would say, not a great king, he was at the time of Elijah, he stopped the korbanot. And therefore, the zoveach, the person who brings sacrifices, this is Yoshiyahu, a wonderful king, le'asher einenu zoveach, to a person who does not bring sacrifices, this is Ahab, who was not a good king. Now you have a good king, a righteous king, a pious king, and an evil king. And what happened to them? Says the Midrash, ze met bechitzim veze met bechitzim. They both died by their enemies, by their hands of their enemies, by shooting arrows at them. And so they both died in the same way. And again, we are, I think, sitting on the edge of our chairs and basically says, this is not fair. This is just not fair. Yoshiyahu had to work so hard to be a good, pious king, righteous king at times where the Jewish people were not that interested. Ahab was an evil king, did horrible things, and you give them the same death? How can we understand God's ways? But the Midrash continues on. Katov kachote. Again, the pasuk says, like the good person, such as the sinner, someone who transgressed God's commandments. Who is Ketov? Ketov, says the Midrash, Zed David. That's King David. Shene'emar, as it says in Samuel A, Vayishlach Vayevieu, that King Saul, not King Saul, that when Samuel asked Shai, David's father, do you have any other children? And he brought him David, and it says, Vehu Tov Roi, and he's a handsome boy, Tov, good looking. But it's not only about the way he looked, but also internally he was good. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Tov Roi behalacha. When it says that he's a Tov Roi, that he's good looking, it means in halacha, that David HaMelech knew how to decide Jewish law. Kol haro'ehu nizkar letalmudo. So everyone who looks at David HaMelech as King David immediately goes back to his Torah learning. So who is kachote? Who is the sinner? Ze Nebuchadnezzar. This is Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, who destroyed the temple. שנאמר, וחטאיך בצדקה פרוק, זה בנה בית המקדש ומלך 40 שנה, וזה החריב בית המקדש ומלך 40 שנה. It says King David reigned over the Jewish people for 40 years. Nebuchadnezzar reigned over his people and the entire empire for 40 years. David HaMelech built the Beit HaMikdash. Now we need to know, David HaMelech did not build the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. It was his son, King Solomon. However, King David prepared everything to build the temple. And not only that, he was the one who requested God to please sit in a temple. As we know, King David built his own palace, and he says to God, I can't do that. I cannot sit and dwell in a palace while the ark is in a tent. And I'm asking you, God, if we can build a house for you. And obviously we all understand that God does not need a house, but that was King David's request. So now, when the Midrash compared David, King David, to Nebuchadnezzar, so a Jewish, pious, righteous King David versus a vicious, evil, vengeful King Nebuchadnezzar. And they did the same thing, just the opposite. They reigned for 40 years. They were kings for 40 years. This one built a temple, this one destroyed the temple. Oy mikre echad. And the Midrash says, Oy, hevei, which means it is what it is, mikre echad. It's the same thing that happened to King David, the same thing happened to Nebuchadnezzar later on. Kanishba. So the pasuk, if you remember, you know what, maybe we'll go 2 down. It says, Hakol asher lakol. If you see the second source on the page, the second line, Katov kachote hanishba kaasher shvua yareh. Someone who was good or is good, who is afraid to take an oath, to someone who is not afraid to take an oath, even though he knows that he's not going to fulfill it. So, the Midrash says, Kanishba, who is the one who took an oath? Zet Zedekiah. That's King Zedekiah, shene'emar v'gam b'melech Nebuchadnezzar marad. If you remember the story with Zedekiah, Zedekiah was appointed by King Nebuchadnezzar to be the king over Jerusalem after Nebuchadnezzar basically exiled most of the people and created a tremendous damage in the land of Israel. He appointed Zedekiah, he changed his name, and he appointed him to be the ruler, the semi-king. And Nebuchadnezzar demanded that Zedekiah will take an oath that he will not rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah took an oath and then violated it. So he obviously fits the description of someone who does not care about taking an oath, knowing he is not going to fulfill it. So who is the one who is very fearful of an oath and he was afraid to take it? Says the Midrash, כאשר שבועה ירא זה שמשון. שמשון the judge, שמשון הגיבור, the mighty שמשון, Samson, שנאמר, ויאמר להם שמשון ישבעו לי פן תפגעון בי. Because Shimshon says, please swear to me that you will not hurt me, and that relates to the story that when Shimshon ran away from Plishtim, he wanted to hide at the territory of the tribe of Yehuda, of Judah. And then the Plishtim came along and they said to the tribe of Judah, where is our enemy? And the tribe of Judah came to Shimshon and they says, look, we have no choice, we need to extradite you. And Shimshon says, I want you to take an oath, please, and I know that you will fulfill it, that you can extradite me, but don't hurt me. And the tribe of Judah did exactly what they promised. So, what's the comparison here? How can they compare Shimshon and Tzidkiah? Says the Midrash, זה מת בניכור עיניים, ואת עיני צדקיהו עיוור, וזה מת בניכור עיניים, ויאחזו אותו פלישתים, וינקרו את עיניו, הדה הוא דכתיב מקרה אחד לנשבע. So, Tzidkiah, after he rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar was very upset, it was outrageous, and he took Tzidkiah, he killed his children, and after that he blinded him. Terrible ending for Tzidkiah. And Shimshon, we also know, they took one of his eyes out. So the Midrash says, this died without his eyes, and this guy died without his eyes. Again, some kind of a very doom and gloom ending. Seems to be that there is really no benefit in being good or not good, because at the end, there are no guarantees that you're going to die in a better way than someone else. So that's one part of the Midrash. The Midrash continues. דבר אחר, מקרה אחד, what does it mean? One case or one situation, one reality? אלו בני אהרון. דכתיב באון בשלום ובמישור. The children of Aaron who died, they were good people. בשלום ובמישור. הלכו איתי. They went with me in a very proper path. לרשע, who is רשע? זה עדת קורח. That's Korah and his 250 clones who came and challenged Moshe and Aaron, basically challenged God. דכתיב בהן סורו נא מעל אהלי האנשים הרשעים האלה. Because Moshe called them רשעים, evil people. אלו נכנסו להקריב במחלוקת ויצאו שרופין, ואלו נכנסו להקריב שלא במחלוקת ויצאו שרופין. If you remember the story from a year ago, when you read Parashat Korah in Sefer Bamidbar in the book of Numbers, so 250 people from Korah's gang went into the tabernacle and they brought some kind of ktoret, and they got burnt. And Nadav and Abihu also brought some kind of ktoret, some kind of incense, and they also got burnt, which means at the end of the day, Korah and his gang and his group got the same punishment as Nadav and Abihu, who seems to be according to the Midrash, that the Midrash tried to basically reflect the idea that they didn't do anything wrong. So point well taken. This Midrash, in a way, is a very depressing Midrash. Basically says to us, at the end, it can be that someone who was very righteous all his life will deserve this death, and the other person who was not good, was not righteous, was not pious, will receive the same death. And then the question that you ask yourself, okay, so what's the point of the Midrash? So I think, before we continue on to the other sources, I think that we can open up few options. We can say that perhaps the point of the Midrash is saying to us, do not even bother. Don't try to understand. Those questions will be like a vicious cycle. because you can always find a different case of someone who is not pious, who is even evil, and he or she have good life, or they will die in a way exactly like the righteous person. So you know what? You will never be able to understand. King Solomon, who was a very smart person, was the wisest person on earth. He himself says, Mikre echad lakol. There is going to be one judgment for everyone. Do not bother. Does not mean that you don't need to try to be a good person, but it's not for a good ending necessarily. So that's perhaps one option. Second option might be that the ending might be the same. But from the minute you are born, that no one asks you, to the minute that you are dead, that no one asks you, which means those are two times in your life, in your lifeline, which are being dictated for you, the day of your birth and the day of your death. The dash between day of birth and day of death, which means our lives, are dependent on us. They depend on us. They basically are going to be shape and form based on what we do. And therefore, perhaps the Midrash says, look, I'm not telling you not to be righteous. I'm not telling you not to be pious. Being righteous and a pious person, it's not because the way you die. It's about the way you live your life, which is now giving us some kind of meaning to life, not for death. Death we will not understand. The way we die we will not understand. But the way we live our lives, that's it, all up to us. The choices we make, the decision we make, that no one is trying to dictate to us what to do. So perhaps what the Midrash says is, Mikre echad lakol, at the end, we all going to die. At the end, we might die at the same way like non-righteous people and evil people. But that's not the point. The point is not death. The point is life. So let's leave that Midrash aside. And I'm going to skip these sources just because those are the verses that I already quoted in the Midrash itself. So, take a look at Rashi. Rashi is the second source on this page, and Rashi wrote a commentary on Kohelet, and he says the following. Mikre echad, one judgment, one ending, one case. It's a little hard to translate the word mikre echad. So let's just open up all the options. Mikre echad might be one ending, one judgment, one case, one event. Says Rashi, ויודעים שסוף הכל, אשר צדיק ואשר רשע, למות. Says, we all know that at the end of the day, we all going to die. ומקרה אחד יש בעולם הזה לכולם. כל זה הם יודעים. No one think that by being righteous, by being pious, I will live forever. ואף על פי כן בוחרים להם דרך הטוב, לפי שיודעים שיש הפרש ביניהם לעולם הבא. Rashi, unlike what I suggested before, takes it to a different realm. He says the focus should be on Olam Abba, the next world to come, which means your mitzvot, choosing to do the right thing, will not save you from death. Death is basically the end of every human being. However, if you, while you were alive, you were not a good person, you didn't follow God's path and commandments, you need to know that in the next world to come, you are not going to be the same like the Rasha. The end of our physical being is the same, but not what comes after. The way you live your life, says Rashi, does not only make a difference in the way you live your life, but also the life in the afterlife, which means the life in Olam Haba, in the world to come. Says Rashi, you work hard, you choose to be good, it's challenging. Especially when you see other people who do no good and they have good life. And basically they sometimes even they are mocking you and say, why do you bother to be such a goody-goody, like a good person, to be a moral person, to be an ethical person, to observe God's ways? Why would you do that when we're all going to die? So, echol v'shato ki machar namut. Eat, drink, have fun, because no one cares. At the end, we're all going to die. And we in Judaism says, it's true, we are all going to die. We're not going to deny the reality. But we are going to deny two things. A, there is a meaning to what we do here. A, for ourselves, to be a good person, to be a moral person, to be an ethical person, to be a sensitive person, to help others, to do kindness. But also in Olam Haba, that we cannot prove it. But we believe that what we do here helps us here and also helps us in the world to come. So basically what Rashi is saying, he says, look at this verse and don't fall into depression, saying, we are all going to die, so why to bother? Exactly the opposite. Work even harder, because it's going to benefit you in Olam Hazeh, it's going to benefit you in this world, as we suggested before, and also in Olam Haba, and also in the next world to come. That's what Rashi says, 11th century France. Now, let's take this theological issue of death, evil person, righteous person, they all have the same punishment at the end or the same ending at the end, but what we do during life, the reward in the next world, let's scale down a bit and let's ask what the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, asked in Tractate Shabbat. Amar Rabbi Ami, Ein mita belo chet ve'en isurin belo avon. This is a very challenging statement by Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami says, death comes only if there is a sin. And afflictions, suffering, comes only if there is also avon, a different type of sin. Which means, according to Rabbi Ami, if I never sin, I will never die and I will never suffer. Which obviously, it's crying out the question, you want to tell me that people suffer because they committed a sin? How would you explain all Jewish history with all our afflictions? How would you explain all the other tragedies, calamities that the Jewish people had to experience? Are you blaming us? Those are heavy theological questions. But let's see what the Gemara had to say. Rabbi Ami tried to substantiate his statement. Ein mita belo chet, there is no death without sin. Tichtiv, because it says, hanefesh hachotet hitamut. The sinning soul will die. Ben lo yisa be'avona, v'av lo yisa be'avona ben tzidkat hatzadik alav tiyeh, v'rishat harasha alav tiyeh. Ein isurin belo avon, tichtiv ufakadeti b'shevet pish'am u'v'negaim avonam. And there is no afflictions, suffering without also some kind of a sin, because it says, and I will judge them because of what? Because of their transgressions. Here, you have two psukim that substantiate Rabbi Ami's opinion. The Gemara, the Talmud, is not happy. And he says, Meitivei, he's questioning, he's challenging Rabbi Ami. He brings a story. Amru malachei hasharet lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the angels, the ministering angel says in front of God, Ribono shel olam, Master of all universe, mipnei ma kanasta mita al Adam harishon. Why did you punish Adam and Chava? Why did you punish them with death? Amar lehem, so God says to the ministering angels, mitzvah kala tziviti ve'avar alea, because I commanded him not to eat from the tree, and he violated it. So here, it seems to be that really God decreed death because of a sin. So the angel says to God, whoa, 1 second. והלא משה ואהרון שקיימו את כל התורה כולה ומתו, But Moshe and Aaron fulfilled the entire Torah without a sin, which now we ignore, hitting the rock, and they died. אמר להם מקרה אחד לצדיק ולרשע. Says, oh, yeah, it's true, but it's one case for everyone. Who de'amar? So here is obviously a question on Rabbi Ami. Why? Because you see that Moshe and Aaron fulfilled the entire Torah, they didn't commit any sin and they still died, which means death has nothing to do, or not only to do with sin. So that's obviously questioning Rabbi Ami. So Rabbi Ami says, oh no. הוא דאמר כי הייתנא דתניא, רבי שמעון בן אלעזר אומר, אף משה ואהרון בחטאם מתו, שנאמר, יען לא האמנתם בי. האמנתם בי? עדיין לא הגיע זמנכם להיפטר מן העולם. So he says, no, Rabbi Ami holds like the opinion that says that no, Moshe and Aaron committed a sin. They hit the rock, instead of talking to the rock, they created disbelief in God, and that's why they died. So now, it's being reinstated. A person will die only if he committed a sin. So the Gemara is still not happy. And the Talmud says, Meitivei arba'a metu be'etyo shel nachash. There are 4 people who died just because, not because they committed any sins. Who are they? Binyamin ben Yaakov, Benjamin, the son of Yaakov. Amram avi Moshe, Amram, Moshe's father. Yishai avi David, Yishai, King David's father, Vekalev ben David, and one of David's children. Vekulu Gemara, and this is our tradition, we don't have any proofs for that, except of Shai. So I am going to skip a bit and go to the last 2 lines. Shma mina, and you can hear from this discussion, Yesh mita belo chet, veyesh isurin belo avon, vetyufta de Rabbi Ami tyufta. This is one of the most fascinating Babylonian Talmud paragraphs that basically brings this theological question and discuss it. The theological question is, how can we explain death and suffering? Rabbi Ami says, you know how we explain it? Sins, transgressions. If a person committed a sin, he deserves suffering or afflictions. If he made a different sin, he will deserve death. Now, do we know exactly what kind of sin someone needs to do to get degree A of suffering or degree B of suffering or a 3rd degree of suffering? We don't know. But don't think that God, in a way, everything is random, and people just get sick or they die because of no reason. Rabbi Ami says, no, theologically you need to understand that God is punishing for a reason. The Talmud was not happy with Rabbi Ami. First, he proved that he was not correct. There are 4 people who died because of no reason. So here, you have death because God said so. And in addition, I think that the Babylonian Talmud, in his second opinion, challenged the entire core understanding of Rabbi Ami. The idea that sickness or death is a punishment, this is something that needs to be discussed. Leave alone the question of what I will call it justification, which means if we ask, for example, why this terrible thing happened to Mr. So-and-so, and we say, that's because he committed some kind of a sin, is that really a good help for us to understand it? In our human eyes, there is no justification to some of the horrors that the Jewish people had to go through. And I'm not talking only about the Shoah, the Holocaust, or October 7th, or you look at the entire Jewish history, and you see from the Crusaders until the expulsion from Spain, and expulsion from England in 1290, expulsion from France in 1305-6, the expulsion from Spain in the 15th century, then the Shoah. I mean, so many different things. What we try to justify it by trying to understand it and try to highlight transgressions and sins. This is outrageous. And I think that's what the Talmud says. Perhaps it's better to live with the question and with the unknown with the uncertainty, with the doubts, rather than to try to play God and to try to say, oh, it's because of a sin. Oh, this is because of A, B, and C. That's why it happens to them. Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, who lived in Perpignan, it's what we call Providence in France, in the late 13th and beginning of 14th century, says the following: מעיקרי הדת, some of the fundamentals of our religion, להאמין, it's to believe, שכל מה שיקרה לאדם מטוב ועד רע, that whatever will happen to a person, good or evil, הכל מושגח מאיתו יתברך השגחה פרטית, it's all come from God. There is providence מצד פעולות האדם, ולא יבלבל זה מה שנראה הוא מהיעדר הסידור למראית עינינו בעניין צדיק ורע לו, רשע וטוב לו. And don't get confused that everything is random, because we see people who are righteous and they suffer, and bad people who are having a wonderful time here. וכן מאמר מקרה אחד לצדיק ולרשע, נאמר גם כן למראה עינינו שאופני המשפט נעלמים ממנו, ולא נדע במה יענש זה ובמה יגמל זה. He says, when we think that we see what we see, we need to understand that what we see, it's not necessarily a true reality. It's our perception, but it's not the real reality. שאין הקדוש ברוך הוא מקפח שכר כל בריאה אם לגמול אם לעונש. והוא שאמרו אין מיתה בלא חטא ואין איסורין בלא עוון. The Meiri is siding דווקא specifically with Rabbi Ami, the opinion that was challenged in Gemara in Shabbat. And he says, no, if I believe in hashgacha pratit, if I believe that God is involved, I cannot say that things are random. I can't say that I don't understand. I can say that if God decided that this righteous person will suffer and this evil person will prosper, there is a reason for that. We don't understand it. ואל יבילהך מאמר ד' מתו בעטיו של נחש, מה שנכנסה מיתה בסיבת הנחש והונחה בטבע, שלא נאמר בטבע אלא דרך הפלגה למיעוט עוונותיהם, עד שלא היו ראויים לעלות במאזניים. He says, when the Talmud challenged Rabbi Ami and says, we found 4 people who died without a sin, he says, it's impossible. Every human being has some kind of a misdeed, some kind of a transgression. So there is no such a thing that you can find 4 perfect people. The only thing that the Talmud says is that their sins were so minuscule that they are almost not considered as a sin and they still died. So therefore, he says, ואף על פי שנשאל דעת האומר כן בטיובתא, אין עיקרי האמונות תלויות בראיות של פשוטי מקראות ואגדות, וכבר ידעת שאין משיבים באגדה, ומה נכבד מאמר אף משה ואהרון בחטא מתו, מכאן ואילך ימחלו האחרים על כבודם. Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri says, even though the opinion of Rabbi Ami that says that death comes because of a sin and suffering comes because of a different sin, says even though it was challenged, this is the right belief, this is the right faith we need to have. And even Moshe and Aaron committed a sin. So if Moshe and Aaron committed a sin, obviously everyone else. Now let's pause here for a second because we need to understand what's going on here. The Meiri does not say that we know what kind of sin brings suffering, what kind of sin brings death. Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri is dealing with the theological question. Is what we see in our world, the punishments, the rewards, the suffering, the afflictions, the calamities, are they just random? God just, or maybe it's not God, it's just like by nature things happen? Is that what we should believe? And this is, by the way, if we believe that everything is random, so then you don't blame God for anything. If you say God has providence and He is the one to direct everything, then obviously the question is, God, come on, we suffer, stop it. Then you have a third option. Oh, we know for sin number A, you get punishment number 2. And that's a problem because for some people it works. It maybe give them some kind of an understanding, but for many of us, you want to tell me that because I didn't give tzedakah as much as I could, I, God forbid, deserve this sickness? Or because I was not nice to someone, or because I didn't do one of the commandments? Is that really come to justify it? This theological question was one of the most difficult, challenging questions in Judaism, but in all other religions as well. It's almost a vicious cycle, because if you say that God is very involved, so then how can you explain all the calamities? Why didn't he stop it? Then if you say if God forbid, is not involved, so then everything is random, and then there is no providence, and then there is no faith, and then there is no sachar ve'onesh, there is no reward and punishment, and then why to bother to do anything? This is exactly our discussion about Nadav and Abihu, Aaron's children, that we began with. As I said at the beginning of this class, this subject is a heavy one. It's a challenging one, and I would say that probably there is no one good answer. But I will suggest the following. This theological challenge can go in many ways, and I think at the end of the day, no one will have any good answer. But perhaps the question that we need to try to focus on is not so much about why things happen to, bad things happen to righteous people and so forth, but really to try to focus on the question of what. What can I do about it? What can I do in response to a calamity? What can I do when I see someone suffer? What can I do when I see death? How do I lead my life that they will be meaningful? What will be at the end, what will I will experience during my life, that it's above my pay grade. But on what I have control, which is decisions that I make, actions that I do, things that I fulfill, what kind of a person I will become, this is up to me. And therefore, in a way, I will challenge each one of us to think about this theological question and to try to focus not so much on the why question, but rather, what did I do today to fight evil? Thank you.